People still don't get it. You know, it's becoming blatantly obvious what's going on around here, and people still don't have eyes to see. There's a large segment of the American populace who still blindly believes that the American government is actually fighting a war against ISIS in Syria. A war, by the way, that was never declared, is not constitutional, but they still believe in their heads that it's actually a war and that the American government is fighting against ISIS terrorists over there.
А вы чего? Разве вы не понимаете, кто там воюет? Там воюют наемники. В основном. Вы знаете, что там платят деньги? И они воюют там, где платят больше. Вот они, поддержали, дали оружие, а завтра половина боевиков оттуда ушла и перешла в ИГИЛ.
It's kind of hard to fight ISIS when they created ISIS. They funded, they armed, they trained ISIS. Declassified memos show that they knowingly supported ISIS before it was even called ISIS, back when they referred to it as Al-Qaeda Iraq, because Al-Qaeda Iraq opposed Assad, and this government wants to overthrow Assad's regime. It's called regime change.
The U.S. and the CIA are working to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, while Russia, a longtime ally of Assad for decades now, is working to defend or uphold this Syrian government of Assad. And this puts us in a position of a possible direct head-to-head conflict with Russia.
That's not a war. That's not a war on terror. That's regime change. That is different. And I've never known a time, at least in my entire life on this planet, and going back and looking at all the regime change that the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon has been involved in for decades in this country and other countries, I've never seen a time like now where they're blatantly being obvious about it, when they're openly declaring that it's their business to regime change.
I want to scare Assad. So I want to go after his presidential guard. I want to bomb his offices in the middle of the night.
Since when did that become the American government's job, by the way, to go around regime changing other countries? And since when is regime change okay? At the beginning of all this serious stuff, all the time we were hearing all this stuff about they're using chemical weapons, there's the red line, blah, 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 blah. But that stuff was all BS. It was all debunked. And when that happened, we haven't heard anything since. We haven't heard anything since about what a horrible monster Assad is. You don't hear that stuff anymore. Because none of it was true to begin with. It's just not true. It's bullshit that this government is relying on the American people, and Western governments are relying on their people to be stupid enough to believe, to continue on with this remapping of the Middle East, which is the ultimate goal here. And to make sure that countries that don't have central banks get their central banks right away. And that's what's going on. And recently we saw something really extraordinary happen. Or not extraordinary, depending on what you've come to expect out of this whole disgusting situation.
US-led coalition planes attacked Syrian forces after entering Syrian airspace from the Iraqi border. We're hearing that there were 4 strikes.
The Pentagon admitted on Saturday that it accidentally targeted the Syrian army, who was on the ground fighting ISIS, actually fighting ISIS, that they quote-unquote regret the mistake that killed 62 Syrian soldiers and wounded 100 others.
After the latest attack, Russia called for an emergency UN Security Council meeting behind closed doors.
Samantha Power was the first one to, I would say, vent her anger publicly, to vent her outrage in front of the media. And when I say outrage, I'm not exaggerating.
Russia decided to join the Assad regime, escalating the conflict. Perhaps worst of all, it's self-adopting some of the regime's worst practices, hitting hospitals.
Good evening. An apology today by President Obama for the deadly American attack on a hospital in Afghanistan. The president calling an accident the horrible tragedy that killed almost 24 patients and medical staff.
And they're calling this emergency meeting? Really? Now, because of a single airstrike, a strike that if it struck regime forces, did so in error.
As Ambassador Power walked in, first thing she said, she was not interested in what I had to say, because what I was saying is a stunt.
Really?
And then you have the establishment mainstream media outlets that go into overdrive explaining this mistake and how it's not like Hollywood, which is pretty funny considering that normally establishment outlets like the New York Times would be championing the military's surgical precision in all these strikes, right? But this time, of course, well, it's what do you want? This isn't a movie. And that's how it's portrayed here. But elsewhere, the Syrian army has come out and said that the U.S. airstrikes were actually tactically coordinated with ISIS attacks on the ground. This is from globalresearch.ca. Translated from Arabic, it says, "We, being the Syrian soldiers, first thought the aircraft are to support us after the first 2 shots, but we quickly found out that they're targeting our forces aggressively while we're fighting IS terrorists. The aircraft used cluster bombs against us. A day before the airstrikes, U.S. drones were flying around and scanning the area. The U.S. airstrikes destroyed all of our equipment and defense points. ISIS fighters attacked us immediately after and during the strikes. Some of them were laughing. U.S. drones and helicopters opened fire from machine guns on our retreated forces. It for sure wasn't a mistake. They targeted us intentionally to help ISIS. America is ISIS itself." Then you have horrible monster Assad come out and do an interview with Associated Press. And I don't know what this guy is over there doing, but nothing about his interviews, he doesn't even seem like a president, let alone some horrible badass that's just doing awful things to his people all the time. He just seems like some guy. But he comes out and says, you don't make a mistake like this firing on Syrian army for over an hour with multiple planes.
It wasn't accident by one airplane for once, let's say. It was 4 airplanes that kept attacking the position of the Syrian troops for nearly 1 hour, or a little bit more than 1 hour. You don't commit a mistake for more than 1 hour. The ISIS troops or the ISIS militants attacked right away after the American strike. How could they know that the Americans are going to attack that position in order to gather the militants to attack right away?
But none of this registered here in America. Or if it did, it barely registered. Because what was happening here at the exact same time? Oh, that's right, a series of terror attacks on the same exact day as all this went down. Linked to ISIS, but kind of linked to ISIS. They're saying it was ISIS, it wasn't ISIS. The details are all super muddy. They're not confirming anything. I saw an article at CNN, supposedly ISIS-linked stabbing in Minnesota, which is not being confirmed by them, but the fact that they already reported it in the headline, most people are going to think it was ISIS regardless. And that's the way they always do with these kinds of stories. They give you a half-truth and they sprinkle in some stuff in there, and then they just start making stuff up, and no one keeps track of things anymore. They just read headlines. So they're reporting it, but then saying they can't confirm it. Well, if you can't confirm it, why are you reporting it if it's unconfirmed? That's not news, that's hearsay. It's because it's propaganda. The point is that ISIS was definitely created to terrorize. They're used to terrorize the Middle East, and when needed, they're used to terrorize us here. Look, remember back when U.S. officials were asking how is it that ISIS ended up driving around in a fleet of Toyota trucks? I'm not even sure why they asked that question, because it's actually come out a year and a half earlier. The State Department specifically sent a fleet of 43 Toyota Helixes, the exact type of truck, to the Free Syrian Army, which, by the way, has been debunked many times. There is no such thing as the Free Syrian Army.
Of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five. We're talking four or five.
4 or 5 U.S. trained fighters. Let's not kid ourselves. That's a joke.
Who's going to vet these people?
Well, first of all, I vetted a number of them because I know them.
I'm just mad because you wrote to Senator McCain personally, but you never got your autographed copy of the photograph of him hugging the terrorist.
I got the coffee mug with him hugging the terrorist. That's actually what I was going to say.
Now they're sending weapons to these supposed rebels, which, John McCain vetted or whatever, which then magically wind up in the hands of ISIS. Oh wow, look at how that happens.
In both Syria and in Iraq is that, equipment and various weaponry while given to the quote-unquote good guys sometimes ends up in the hands of the quote-unquote bad guys.
And then they blame it on Jordan. Jordan, the location of the secret CIA military base that supposedly is where all the ISIS people were trained in the first place. Do you see what I'm saying? So now, ISIS ends up with all the weapons, which they then use to kill the American soldiers that are sent over there, whose boots were never supposed to be on the ground in Syria to begin with.
This, there was never this no boots on the ground. I don't know where this keeps coming from.
Well, yes.
There wasn't.
We would not put boots on the ground.
Will not lead into boots in the ground. There would be no American boots on the ground.
I will not put American boots on the ground in Syria.
And there's boots on the ground in Libya now, even though there's no constitutionally declared war there. And we don't even know where all of our soldiers are being sent anymore or why. Afghanistan's now the longest war in this nation's history. And now they're saying that the US has dropped 50,000 bombs on ISIS. Okay. Am I just not clear on how bombs work? Because if they dropped 50,000 bombs on something, it shouldn't still be there. The truth is, the only truth, is that we, the American people, have no idea what's really going on over there. We only know what we're being told by government officials and the establishment media, and that's the box we live in on this. It's the terror box. The one you're supposed to live your whole entire life blindly and fearfully inside. Watch the next time one of these mistakes happen. Look at what happens here in coordination with that. Watch the news and see, because over there the US military fired upon the Syrian army as it was trying to fight ISIS terrorists. And as soon as it came out that that happened and that it was coordinated with ISIS attacks on the ground, US government goes in, shoots up the Syrian army, and then on the ground, ISIS attacks them while they're down. It's all coordinated. As soon as that came out, and suddenly ISIS is the scary boogeyman who's bombing New York and New Jersey and stabbing people in Minnesota, right? But ask yourself honestly, do we really know what's actually going on? Except a bunch of lies, propaganda, and false flags.
Dear President Obama, remember the boy who was picked up by the ambulance in Syria? Can you please go get him and bring him to our home?
The humanity that a young child can display, who hasn't learned to be cynical or suspicious or fearful of other people because of where they're from or how they look or how they pray. We can all learn from Alice.
People still don't get it. It's becoming blatantly obvious what's going on around here, and people still don't have eyes to see. There's a large segment of the American populace who still blindly believes that the American government is actually fighting a war against ISIS in Syria. A war by...
Платят деньги. И они воюют там, где платят больше. Вот они, поддержали, дали оружие, а завтра половина боевиков оттуда ушла и перешла в ИГИЛ.
It's kind of hard to fight ISIS when they created ISIS. They funded, they armed, they trained ISIS. Declassified memos show that they knowingly supported ISIS before it was even called ISIS, back when they referred to it as Al-Qaeda Iraq. Because Al-Qaeda Iraq opposed Assad, and this government wants to overthrow Assad's regime. It's called regime change.
The US and the CIA are working to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad, while Russia, a longtime ally of Assad for decades now, is working to defend or uphold this Syrian government of Assad. And this puts us in a position of a possible direct head-to-head conflict with Russia.
That's not a war. That's not a war on terror. That's regime change. That is different. And I've never known, by the way, it was never declared, is not constitutional, but they still believe in their heads that it's actually a war and that the American government is fighting against ISIS terrorists over there.
А вы чего? Разве вы не понимаете, кто там воюет? Там воюют наемники. В основном. Вы знаете, что там